The year is 1713. A fragile peace has settled over the globe, but for thousands of men, it feels more like a new, devastating war. The Treaty of Utrecht has ended the War of the Spanish Succession, a conflict that has raged across empires for over a decade. It was a global struggle for power and empire, with the navies of Great Britain and its allies clashing against the formidable sea power of France and Spain. This wasn't merely a fight over a distant throne. It was a bloody contest for control of the world's most lucrative trade routes, for the wealth of the Spanish Main, and for the very future of naval dominance. For 12 years, the sea was your home and your battlefield. You and your fellow sailors fought with brutal efficiency, hardened by the cannon fire and the unforgiving elements. You were the lifeblood of the empire, the instruments of its power. But with peace, the vast military machine that had consumed your lives is now dismantled. The Royal Navy, bloated by wartime necessity, has no further use for you. These men, accustomed to the rigid discipline and brutal hierarchy of naval life, are unceremoniously cast adrift. The skills you honed of fighting, of sailing, of surviving, are suddenly useless. The world you now face is a cruel and unforgiving place. The economy is in shambles, and jobs are scarce. The merchant ships, the only remaining vessels that offer a life at sea, pay starvation wages, if they're hiring at all. The price of bread has skyrocketed, and the streets of London are filled with the unemployed, the hungry, and the desperate. The joy of victory and the camaraderie of the crew have been replaced by a gnawing emptiness. You were heroes one day, and ghosts the next. This feeling of betrayal, of being discarded after years of service, is a corrosive poison that eats away at your spirit. In this world of chaos and despair, a new, more desperate way of life is born. A life that is outside the law, outside the norms of society. A life that is free, dangerous, and often short. A life of piracy. You stand on the Portsmouth docks, the scent of salt and fish, a familiar comfort. But today, it is a comfort tinged with the bitter taste of betrayal. You clutch your final pay 3 months' wages for 12 years of service. For 12 years, you have fought for king and country. You have sailed the treacherous waters of the Atlantic. You have fought in bloody battles. You have lost friends and comrades to the unforgiving sea and the even more unforgiving Spanish guns. You have done your duty, and this is your reward. Around you, 36,000 other men face the same grim reality. They are men like you, seasoned sailors with hands as hard as wood and faces as weathered as old charts. Their bodies are a testament to the sea, their spirits broken by the land. You watch as they disperse, their faces a mask of quiet despair and a deep-seated depression. Some will try to find work on the merchant ships, a futile search that will lead them to starvation wages and a life of misery. Others will simply disappear, swallowed up by the vast, unforgiving city. Your stomach growls as you count your dwindling coins. It is a familiar sound, a sound you have come to despise. It is the sound of a man who is hungry, a man who is a ghost in a world that has no use for him. You have no family, no home, no future. You have only the skills to fight and sail, and no one wants to pay for them anymore. The merchant captains, their faces hard and their voices cold, offer you a few pence, a few scraps of food, for a life of endless labour. You look out at the sea, a vast blue expanse that seems to beckon you, to call your name. You can feel the pull of the water, the siren song of the waves. It is a song that you have heard since you were a boy, a song that has been a constant companion throughout your life. But today, the song is different. It is a song of desperation, a song of defiance, a song of rebellion. There has to be another way. A life on the sea, but on your own terms. A life where you are the captain, the master of your own destiny. A life of piracy. You are a man who has nothing to lose. And in a world that has taken everything from you, that is a powerful thing. The docks of Portsmouth, once a symbol of British might, now felt like a graveyard. The air, thick with the smell of brine and tar, was a constant, suffocating reminder of your past life. You spent 2 long, brutal years as a ghost, a shadow in the gutter. You worked odd jobs for a few pence, your body aching with every movement, your spirit worn down by the constant struggle. You were a man with no home, no family, and no future. The Royal Navy had given you the skills to survive, but it had left you in a world that had no use for them. The merchant ships, the only remaining vessels that offered a life at sea, were a joke. The captains were cruel, the crews were half-starved, and the pay was barely enough to keep you from freezing to death. You had worked on a few of them, and each time you had left with a sense of quiet despair. This was not the life you had fought for. This was not the sea you had loved. This was a prison, a different kind of confinement than the one you had known in the Royal Navy. Your despair, however, was not unique. It was a disease that spread like wildfire among the thousands of unemployed sailors who haunted the docks of London. In the dark, smoky taverns, in the back alleys, in the small, cramped rooms, a new kind of conversation was taking place. Whispers of a new life, a new way of being, a new kind of freedom. They called it the sweet trade. It was a life outside the law, outside the norms of society. It was a life of danger, of risk, and of great reward. It was a life of piracy. You had heard the whispers, but you had always dismissed them as a sailor's drunken fantasies. But as the months turned into years, and your hunger turned into a constant, gnawing pain, the whispers began to sound less like a fantasy and more like a promise. Your psychological struggle was not just about money, but about a more fundamental need for justice and respect. You had served the crown, and the crown had cast you aside. This was a rebellion, a desperate cry against a system that had betrayed you. The tavern keeper in Port Royal was a man who knew things. He was a man who had seen it all, a man who knew where the money was and where the trouble was. You had been in the tavern for a week, nursing a single watered-down ale, your ears open to the whispers around you. You had heard the names of a few captains, but one name kept coming up, Captain Hornigold. He was a pirate, a privateer who had turned to a life of crime after the war ended. But the stories you heard about him were different. They did not speak of cruelty or of a thirst for blood. They spoke of a man who was fair with his men, a man who followed a code. When you finally approached the tavern keeper, his eyes, dark and knowing, met your own. You asked him about a captain, a man who was looking for a good sailor. He leaned close, and his voice, a low whisper, was barely audible above the din of the tavern. "There's always Captain Hornigold's crew," he whispered. "They say he's fair with his men, follows the code." Within a week, you were aboard a sloop bound for Nassau, a small, bustling island that was a haven for pirates. The journey was short, but it was filled with a sense of quiet triumph. The sea, once a symbol of your past life, was now a symbol of your future. You were no longer a sailor without a ship. You were a man on his way to a new life, a new destiny. When you arrived in Nassau, the first thing you saw was the black flag flying openly. It was a banner of rebellion, a symbol of freedom from a world that had rejected you. The streets were filled with men like you, men who had been cast adrift by the Royal Navy. They were men with hard hands and weathered faces, men who had found a new home, a new family. There was a palpable sense of shared purpose, a quiet understanding that they were all in this together. You met with Captain Hornigold, a man with a weathered face and a kind smile. He did not ask you for your name. He did not ask you for your past. He asked you to sign the articles, a set of laws that governed his crew. The articles were read aloud as you signed. Equal shares of prize, compensation for wounds, and democracy in all things save battle. For the first time since the war ended, you felt like you belonged somewhere. You were no longer a ghost. You were a man, a pirate, and you had a home. As you signed the articles, a cheer erupted from the assembled crew, a defiant roar of men who had been given a second chance, a second life. You were one of them now, and you would not be a ghost ever again. The articles you signed in Nassau were a revelation. They were not the cruel dictates of a tyrant, but the fair laws of free men. The months that followed were a blur of training, of learning, of becoming a new kind of sailor. You learned the trade quickly. You learned how to spot a merchant sail on the horizon, a telltale glimmer of white against the vast blue sea. You learned how to read the winds, how to anticipate a ship's movements, how to outmaneuver a lumbering warship. You were a man who had spent his life on the sea, but this was a different kind of sailing. This was a life of purpose, a life of freedom. The sight of a merchant ship, their sails filled with the wind, their holds filled with the riches of the New World, would fill you with a quiet, burning sense of anticipation. You were no longer fighting for a king who had discarded you. You were fighting for yourself, for your comrades, for a life of freedom. You learned how to board a ship without bloodshed when possible, a skill you had never been taught in the Royal Navy. The goal was not to kill, but to intimidate, to strike fear into the hearts of the merchant sailors. The mere sight of the Jolly Roger, a black flag with a skull and crossbones, could make a ship surrender without firing a shot. It was a symbol of your rebellion, a sign that you were no longer a ghost, but a force to be reckoned with. Your captain, Benjamin Hornigold, was a man of quiet authority. He was not a brute or a tyrant. He was a leader, a man who had earned the respect of his men through his fairness and his courage. But there was another man on the crew, a protix of Hornigold, who was a different kind of beast. His name was Edward Teach, a man with a wild, dark beard and eyes that seemed to hold the fires of hell. You watched as Hornigold taught him everything about psychological warfare. It was a new kind of battle, a battle of the mind, a battle of terror. You watched as Teach began to transform himself into something more terrifying than any man should be. He would braid hemp and slow matches into his beard, and when he was ready for battle, he would light them. The sight of him, a man wreathed in smoke and fire, was enough to make the most hardened sailor tremble. He was no longer just a man. He was a demon, a monster, a force of nature. Your admiration for his strength was a complicated thing. You admired his courage, his audacity, his willingness to go beyond the limits of what a man should be. You saw in him a reflection of the anger, the rage, the sense of betrayal that you yourself felt. But your admiration was also tinged with a growing sense of fear. Teach was a man who seemed to have no limits. He was a man who seemed to have lost his humanity. He was a man who was becoming something else, something terrifying, something that you were not sure you wanted to be a part of. The whispers in the crew were a constant, unsettling presence. They spoke of Teach's growing thirst for power, his growing obsession with terror. They spoke of a man who was no longer content to simply take a ship and its cargo. They spoke of a man who wanted to rule the seas, a man who wanted to be a king. You had found a new home, a new family, but you were beginning to realize that your new life was just as dangerous as your old one. You were no longer just fighting for your survival. You were fighting for your soul. His ruthlessness was not a product of blind rage, but of cold, calculating theatre. One afternoon, after a merchant sloop had surrendered without a fight, you watched as Teach summoned the captured captain to the deck. The man, trembling with fear, expected a quick end. Instead, Teach simply smiled, a chillingly calm expression in the chaos of the captured ship. He ordered his crew to tie the man to a mast, and then, without a word, he took out a pistol and fired a shot just inches from the man's ear. The captain screamed, his body going rigid, but Teach simply reloaded the pistol with a leisurely grace, his eyes fixed on the man. "The next one will not miss," he said in a low, even voice. "Now go, and tell every port you visit that you have seen the devil, and he is a man of his word." He released the man unharmed, knowing that the story the captain would tell would be worth more than 1,000 dead bodies. His demeanour with his own crew was equally unsettling. He was not cruel in the way a merchant captain was. He did not flog his men for sport or deny them their share of the plunder. But you watched as he maintained his control through a different kind of power. A young man, barely a year into his service, once questioned Teach's decision to attack a heavily armed warship, arguing it was a fool's errand. The air went still. Everyone expected bloodshed. Instead, Teach simply walked up to the boy, his face a mask of cold fury. "There are two kinds of men on this ship, boy," he said, his voice a low, terrifying growl. "Those who follow the captain and those who walk the plank. You will make your choice, and you will make it now." The boy, his face ashen, stammered a swift apology. Teach simply nodded, a thin, cruel smile on his face. The message was clear. There was no democracy when it came to his command. This was not a man who was just a pirate. This was a man who was building a legend, a man who was cultivating fear as a weapon. He was not just taking ships, he was taking souls. The whispers in the crew had become a chorus, a constant, unsettling presence that spoke of a coming change. The whispers were right. One morning, Benjamin Hornigold, a man of quiet authority, called you and the rest of the crew to the deck. He was an honourable man, a man who believed in a code, and he had made his fortune. It was time for him to go. You watched as he gave his ship, a fast and beautiful sloop, to his protege. And with that single act, the legend was born. When Teach takes command of his own vessel, you follow him. You are no longer just a sailor. You are a pirate, a part of a legend. The world you once knew, the world of the Royal Navy and the merchant ships, is gone. You are a man with a new destiny, a new purpose. Teach, now calling himself Blackbeard, is no longer just a man. He is a myth, a force of nature. His beard, once a simple thing, is now a work of art, a symbol of his power and his ruthlessness. He is a man who has perfected the art of terror, a man who knows that fear is a more powerful weapon than any cannon. The first step in his plan is to capture the perfect ship. The opportunity comes in the form of a French slaver, a massive vessel with a high deck and a fearsome reputation. You and the crew under the command of Blackbeard chase her for a day and a night. The pursuit is brutal, a constant, unrelenting struggle against the winds and the waves. But Blackbeard's ship, a fast and nimble vessel, is no match for the lumbering slaver. When you finally catch her, you board her without a single shot fired. The crew, their faces pale with terror, surrender without a fight. Blackbeard, his eyes burning with a dark, triumphant fire, rechristens her the Queen Anne's Revenge. She is a beautiful ship, a three-masted frigate with a high deck and a fearsome reputation. But she is not yet perfect. You and the crew, under the command of Blackbeard, spend the next few weeks mounting 40 cannons on her decks, turning her into the most feared ship in the Caribbean. You work tirelessly, your hands raw and your muscles screaming in protest. But you are not just a sailor anymore. You are a pirate, a part of a legend. You are building a monster, a weapon of terror that will strike fear into the hearts of every man who sails the seas. The legend of Blackbeard spreads like wildfire. The stories are whispered in every port, in every tavern, in every corner of the world. They speak of a man who is more demon than man, a man who has lost his soul to the sea. The merchants, the privateers, the sailors, they all know his name. They all know his flag. They all know that to see him is to face a choice. Surrender or die. Your finest hour comes in the spring of 1718. You and the crew, under the command of Blackbeard, blockade the port of Charleston, one of the busiest colonial ports in the world. You hold an entire city hostage with nothing but your reputation and your audacity. The city's inhabitants, terrified of the legend of Blackbeard, surrender without a fight. You demand a ransom, a chest full of medicine for your sick crew. The city, in its panic, complies. You have won. You have defeated a city, a government, an empire, with nothing but your audacity. But even as you celebrate, you notice a subtle, unsettling change in the air. The net is tightening around Nassau. The colonial powers, who had once ignored the pirates, are now taking notice. The Royal Navy, the same system that had cast you adrift, is now on the hunt. The whispers in the taverns are no longer about freedom and rebellion. They are about the king's pardon, a promise of forgiveness for those who would turn their back on the sweet trade. You are a pirate, a man who has found a new life, a new purpose. But you are beginning to realize that your new life is just as dangerous as your old one. You are no longer just fighting for your survival. You are fighting for your soul and for your life. The world you had left behind is now coming to get you. The clock is ticking and your time is running out. You notice a profound, disturbing change in Blackbeard after the Charleston blockade. He is no longer just a man with a plan, but a man obsessed with his own legend. You begin to resist his actions, but you are too afraid to succeed. You have seen what happens to those who question him. You have seen the fear in his own crew's eyes. You have seen the subtle, terrifying power he wields over them. But you have a secret weapon. Your quiet, unwavering resistance. You refuse to participate in his cruel, theatrical rituals. You refuse to let the fear take hold of you. You are a man who has nothing to lose, and in a world that has taken everything from you, that is a powerful thing. You know that you cannot defeat him with force. You know that you cannot defeat him with words. You can only defeat him with your soul, and you will not let him take it from you. The whispers in the taverns had been right. The king's pardon, a promise of forgiveness for those who would turn their back on the sweet trade, was just a prelude to a larger, more sinister plan. The colonial powers, who had once ignored the pirates, were now taking notice. The Royal Navy, the same system that had cast you adrift, was now on the hunt. You and the rest of the crew, a small, fragile family of outcasts, were living on borrowed time. The Queen Anne's revenge, once a symbol of your power, was now a target. The clock was ticking, and your time was running out. You, a man who had nothing to lose, had found something to fight for, your soul. You had resisted Blackbeard's cruel theatrical rituals. You had refused to let the fear take hold of you. You had seen what happened to those who questioned him. You had seen the fear in his own crew's eyes. You had seen the subtle, terrifying power he wielded over them. You knew that you could not defeat him with force. You knew that you could not defeat him with words. You could only defeat him with your soul, and you would not let him take it from you. The attack came at dawn in Ocracoke Inlet. The morning mist, a soft, ethereal veil, clung to the water, giving the world a deceptive, peaceful glow. You and the rest of the crew were still asleep, lulled into a false sense of security by the quiet of the morning. But the peace was a lie. The sound of a bell, a single clear peal, cut through the silence. You ran to the deck, your heart a frantic drum against your ribs, and there they were. The HMS Pearl and HMS Lime, two warships of the Royal Navy, appeared through the morning mist, their guns already run out. Lieutenant Robert Maynard, a man with a cold, unforgiving face and eyes like black stones, had found you at last. The battle was brief but vicious. The Royal Navy, with its superior numbers and its disciplined crews, was no match for the pirates. The air filled with the sound of cannon fire, the splintering of wood, the screams of the wounded. You fought with a desperate, savage fury, a man who had been a ghost and was not willing to go back. You fought for your freedom, for your soul, for your life, but you were losing. The battle was brief but savage. The Royal Navy's tactics, honed by decades of discipline and training, were superior. Their boats, filled with armed marines, swarmed the decks of your ship. The air filled with the roar of muskets, the clang of steel on steel, and the screams of the wounded. You fought with the fury of a man who had been a ghost and was not willing to go back. A marine, his bayonet fixed, lunged at you from the side. You saw the glint of the steel, a flash of white in the chaos of the battle. You ducked, the bayonet whistling past your ear, so close you could feel the wind it left behind. You turned and rammed your cutlass into his chest, the man's eyes wide with a final, surprised look before he fell to the deck. Moments later, a cannonball, a massive iron sphere, tore through the air, hitting the mast with a deafening crack. The mast, a massive piece of wood, splintered and came crashing down. You, a man who had lived his life on the sea, instinctively knew to get out of the way. You dove to the deck, the mast narrowly missing your head. You lay there for a moment, your body a mass of aches and pains, your mind a blur of noise and chaos. You saw Blackbeard fall with 25 wounds, his body a broken, bloody heap on the deck. Maynard, a man who was not content to simply defeat his enemy, ran his sword through Blackbeard's body, and then, with a single, brutal motion, severed his head as proof of victory. The legend was dead. The myth was over. The man who had been a demon was now just a corpse. Wounded and captured, you were taken to the HMS Pearl, your hands bound, your body a mass of aches and pains. You faced the gallows alongside your surviving crewmates, a silent, defiant procession of men who had been discarded by the Royal Navy and were now to be hung by it. The gallows, a grim wooden structure, stood on the docks, a silent promise of your fate. But Maynard, a man who was as cunning as he was brutal, offered you a choice. He looked at you, his eyes a cold, unwavering gaze. He spoke of the king's pardon, a promise of forgiveness for those who would turn their back on the sweet trade. He spoke of a new life, a life free from the constant fear of the gallows. He offered you a choice: hang as a pirate or serve the crown as a pressed sailor. It was an impossible choice, a choice between two kinds of death. One was a quick, brutal end on the gallows. The other was a life of quiet desperation, a return to the very life you had fought so hard to escape. You looked at the gallows, at the faces of your crewmates, at the cold, unforgiving face of Maynard, and you realized, with a chilling clarity, that the choice was not between life and death, but between freedom and slavery. You were a man who had nothing to lose. And in a world that had taken everything from you, that was a powerful thing. You were a man who had fought for his soul, and you would not give it up. What will you do? Will you choose the gallows, a final act of defiance against a system that had betrayed you? Or will you choose a life of quiet desperation, a life of slavery, a life that is a different kind of death? The choice, in the end, is yours. The gallows, a grim and silent witness to the end of your short-lived freedom, stood before you. You looked at the faces of your surviving crewmates, men who had been your family, your comrades, your fellow ghosts. You looked at the cold, unforgiving face of Lieutenant Robert Maynard, the man who had defeated the legend of Blackbeard. You looked at the sea, a vast blue expanse that had been your home for a lifetime, and you made your choice. You would not give him the satisfaction of watching you hang. You would not give him the satisfaction of a final act of defiance. You would live, you would fight, you would survive. The irony of your situation was not lost on you. You were a man who had fought against the Royal Navy for a decade, a man who had been a ghost in a world that had no use for him, and now you were fighting for the same navy that cast you aside 7 years ago. The officers, men who had once looked down on you as a common sailor, now saw you as a valuable asset. You were a man who had lived a life outside the law, a man who had seen the world from the other side of the flag. You knew the trade, you knew the tactics, you knew how pirates think. Your knowledge of their weaknesses, their habits, their haunts, made you an invaluable tool in their hunt. But you were not a man to them. You were a weapon, a dog on a leash. Your time aboard the HMS Pearl was a constant, grueling test of your resolve. You were not just a sailor, you were a prisoner. The officers, men who had no love for pirates, were a constant source of torment. They would pull you aside in the dark, smoky corners of the ship, their voices low and menacing. They would remind you of your past, of the crimes you had committed, of the life you had chosen. They would tell you that you were a dead man walking, a man who was only alive because of their generosity. You were a man who deserved to be hanged, and they would see to it that you remembered that every day of your life. The threats were a constant, terrifying presence, a psychological torture that was more painful than any physical lash. One night, an officer, a man with a cruel smile and eyes like black stones, took you to his cabin. He put a pistol on the table, a long black object that seemed to hum with a quiet menace. "Tell me everything you know about their hiding places," he said, his voice a low, threatening growl. "Tell me about their routes. Tell me about their friends. Tell me everything, and you might just live to see another day. Refuse, and you will learn the true meaning of a slow and painful death." You looked at the pistol, at the man's cold, unforgiving eyes, and you felt a cold, terrifying fear wash over you. But you also felt a quiet, burning defiance. You were not a man who was afraid of death. You were a man who was afraid of losing his soul. The life of a pressed sailor was a life of quiet desperation. The conditions were better than the merchant ships, but the cruelty was the same. The officers never let you forget your past. You were a pirate, a man who had broken the law, a man who deserved to be hanged. They looked at you with a mixture of fear and contempt, a silent reminder of your past life. You, a man who had once been a free spirit, a man who had voted on every decision, were now a slave, a prisoner on your own ship. But you were not a man who gave up. You had fought for your soul, and you would not let them take it from you. You did your duty, you followed orders, you endured the subtle and not so subtle insults. You kept your head down and your mouth shut. You were a ghost again, a silent shadow on the deck, a man who was there but not really there. You had nothing to lose, and in a world that had taken everything from you, that was a powerful thing. You were a man who had learned to survive, a man who knew how to play the game. When word came that Captain Barnett was hunting the notorious Anne Bonny and Mary Read off Jamaica, you were selected for the crew. The two women, a legend in their own right, were a constant thorn in the side of the Royal Navy. They were a reminder of a life you had left behind. You were a man who knew these waters, a man who knew how pirates think. You knew their tactics, their routes, their hiding places. You were a man who had been a ghost and was not willing to go back. But duty and the constant, terrifying threat of the lash kept you at your station. Part of you, a part that was buried deep within your soul, hoped they would escape. You hoped they would outrun the Royal Navy, that they would find a way to live a life of freedom. But you knew that you could not show your hope. You could not show your compassion. You were a ghost, a silent shadow on the deck, a man who was there but not really there. You had nothing to lose. The sun beat down on the deck of your ship, a relentless, punishing heat that clung to your skin. The air, thick with the smell of salt and tar, was a constant reminder of your past life. Day bled into night, marked by the rhythmic slap of waves against the hull and the groan of the rigging. You stood watch, your eyes scanning the horizon, not for your own sake, but for the sake of the men who saw you as little more than a necessary evil. You watched the other sailors, the ones who had been pressed into service from merchant ships or privateers, their faces a mix of fear and boredom. They were not like you. They hadn't lived the life of absolute freedom, the life where every dawn was a gamble and every sunset a victory. They were just sailors. You were a man who had been a ghost, and now you were a hunter. Then came the sighting. Sail ho! The cry came from the crow's nest, slicing through the mundane reality of the afternoon watch. It was a single sloop, its sails a dirty white against the deep blue of the sky. The words spread through the ship like a wildfire. The sloop Revenge, captained by Calico Jack Rackham, with Anne Bonny and Mary Read rumoured to be aboard. A low murmur of excitement and dread rippled through the crew. The officers barked orders, their voices sharp with a mix of anticipation and a familiar, quiet fear. The engagement with Rackham's sloop was not the grand, heroic battle you had imagined, not like the stories told of Blackbeard's last stand. It was a miserable, half-hearted affair, a testament to the fact that not all pirates were created equal. As your ship closed the distance, the first cannonballs were fired from the Revenge wildly, without any real aim. The shots were a joke, a pathetic display of bravado from a crew that had lost its nerve. The Royal Navy boarding party was assembled, muskets at the ready, cutlasses drawn. You were a part of that party, a man standing among the hunters, a ghost among the living. You watched the sloop come into view, its deck a chaotic, shambling mess. The male pirates, a motley crew of men who had been drinking all night, were a pathetic sight. They cowered below deck, drunk and cowardly, their bravado gone, their fear a palpable thing. They were a mockery of the life you had once lived, a stain on the memory of the men you had once fought alongside. The men you had admired, the men who had shown courage in the face of impossible odds, were nothing like this. These men were a joke. But then you saw them, two figures, alone on the main deck, standing their ground against the approaching Royal Navy. Two figures who fought like devils. Anne Bonny, her red hair, a defiant splash of colour, whipped in the wind as she fired pistol after pistol. She was a sight to behold, a creature of pure, unadulterated fury. Her story was one of defiance from the start. Born in Ireland, she was the illegitimate daughter of a lawyer who later brought her to the Carolinas. Known for her fiery temper, she once reportedly beat a man who had attempted to rape her. When she fell in love with a penniless sailor and was disowned by her father, she fled to the pirate haven of Nassau. There, she met Calico Jack Rackham and became his partner, both on land and at sea. She was described as a woman of courage and fierce temper, and a natural leader who earned respect not through fear, but through her sheer audacity. Now, standing alone on that deck, she embodied every piece of her legend. The Royal Navy boarding party halted, stunned for a moment by the ferocity of her attack. She was a hurricane in human form, a whirlwind of lead and fire, a force of nature that refused to be contained. She was everything you had once been, everything you had lost. Beside her, a stark and deadly contrast, was Mary Read. While Bonnie was fire, Read was ice. Her cutlass flashed, a silver streak against the bruised sky, as she held the boarding party at bay single-handedly. Her life was a masterclass in disguise and survival. From a young age, she was dressed as a boy by her mother to receive an inheritance. She continued this ruse for years, serving as a footman and later as a soldier in the British Army, where she distinguished herself with her bravery. She lived as a man, fought in battles, and even fell in love with a Flemish soldier whom she later married. After her husband's death, she returned to her male disguise and took to the seas, where she was captured by pirates, and eventually joined Rackham's crew. Her experience as a soldier made her a formidable fighter, known for her exceptional skill with a cutlass and her unwavering courage. She was not as flamboyant as Bonnie, but her quiet determination and deadly skill were just as intimidating. You watched her move, her footwork precise, her strikes economical. She was a quiet storm, a dancer of death, and you felt a deep, profound respect for her. You've never seen such courage, not even among Blackbeard's crew. The men you had once admired, the men you had once fought alongside, were a joke. They had all been replaced by these two women, these fierce, relentless warriors who were a testament to the true spirit of piracy. They were not fighting for gold or for fame. They were fighting for their lives, for their freedom, for a future that was being taken from them. They were fighting for their souls. The order came to fire. The sound of a dozen muskets erupted around you, but you did not fire. Your hands, the hands that had once held a wheel and a bottle of rum, held your musket, but you did not pull the trigger. You watched the two women, their courage a beacon in the cowardice. You watched them fight, two against an army, and you felt a new kind of pride, a quiet admiration for a spirit you had thought was dead. You knew what you had to do. You couldn't let them be taken alive, not after this, not after you had seen their souls, a reflection of your own. Your musket was still, your hands steady, your heart a frantic drum against your ribs. You aimed, not at the centre of her chest, but at a non-lethal target. You aimed at Mary Read, your target, a blur of motion and defiance. You fired. The musket ball took her in the shoulder, a single, clean shot. You felt no triumph, only respect for a worthy enemy. She fell, but she did not scream, she did not cry. She simply looked at you, her eyes a mix of pain and defiance. And in that look, you saw a reflection of your own soul. You were a man who had lost everything, and in a world that has taken everything from you. That is a powerful thing. You are a man who has learnt to survive, a man who knows how to play the game. The air on the deck of the Revenge had gone from thick with gunpowder smoke to heavy with the silence of defeat. The two women, Anne Bonny and Mary Read, now stood alone, surrounded by the triumphant Royal Navy sailors. You, a man who had pulled the trigger with a mix of respect and regret, watched as your comrades swarmed the deck, their shouts of victory a harsh counterpoint to the quiet dignity of the captured women. Mary Read, her shoulder bleeding from your musket ball, was the first to be disarmed, a small, sad irony that her resistance had been ended by a man who had once been like her. Anne Bonny, however, was another matter entirely. She fought like a wildcat, her eyes blazing with a fury that no chain could contain. Her pistols gone, she drew a cutlass, a blade that had once been her companion in 1,000 raids, and a symbol of her freedom. The Royal Navy boarding party, emboldened by their numbers and the visible cowardice of the male crew, moved to subdue her. It was a mistake. They advanced on her, their faces flushed with the anticipated victory, and she met them head-on. She was a whirlwind of motion, her cutlass a blur of light and shadow, her screams of defiance a song of rage that echoed across the water. You were still on the gunwale, the smoke from your musket still curling in the air, when one of the sailors, a young man who looked terrified and exhilarated all at once, lunged at her. Anne Bonny met his charge, her cutlass flashing. The sound of steel on steel was a sudden, jarring chord in the quiet aftermath of the battle. You watched, mesmerized by her ferocity, a ferocity you recognized from the wild, free days of your own past. She was a hurricane, in human form, a force of nature that refused to be contained. You admired her courage, the same courage that had been stripped from the men on her crew, and slowly, mercilessly, from you. Another sailor, a brutish man with a cruel smile, moved to flank her. It was a fatal mistake. Your training took over. You knew what was about to happen before it did. He would move to pin her arm, to disarm her, to bring her to the deck, and she would respond with the same deadly precision that had made her a legend. You could not let this happen. You were a man who had learned to survive, a man who knew how to play the game. You could not let them hurt her, not after what she had done. You moved without thinking, a ghost in the chaos, a man who had nothing left to lose. You moved to intercept the brutish sailor, but your attention was divided, your focus split between the brutal reality of the moment and the impossible courage of the woman fighting before you. Your musket was useless now, an empty shell, a symbol of your past. Your cutlass was at your side, but you did not draw it. You would not fight against your own kind, even if they were now your enemies. You moved to push the brutish sailor out of the way, to give Anne Bonny a moment of space, a moment to breathe, a moment to live. A cutlass stroke from Anne Bonny opens your left leg from knee to ankle. The world, which had been so sharp and clear, exploded in a burst of white-hot agony. The force of the blow, delivered with a speed and a viciousness that could only come from years of training, sent you reeling backward. The pain was a living thing, a serpent of fire that coiled around your leg and sank its fangs deep into your flesh. You had been a man of iron, a man who had endured beatings and torture, but this was a different kind of pain. This was the pain of betrayal, of a mistake, of an action that had cost you everything. You fell to the deck, a crumpled heap of pain and regret, and you watched as she screamed defiance at her captured lover. If you'd fought like a man, you wouldn't be hanged like a dog. The words, delivered with a passion that made your heart ache, were a testament to her courage, to her fierce loyalty. They were the words of a woman who had lost everything, a woman who had fought for her soul, and who would not give it up, not for anyone. The sight of her, a beautiful, raging creature, in the midst of a battlefield, was a sight that would haunt your dreams for the rest of your life. The men of the Royal Navy, stunned by her fury, finally managed to subdue her. Her arms pinned behind her back, a chain around her wrists. But even in her defeat, she was a queen, a goddess of the sea, a force of nature that refused to be contained. You lay there, a broken man on a broken deck, the blood from your leg seeping into the splintered wood, a dark stain that was both a testament to your folly and a symbol of your freedom. The ship's surgeon, a greasy, overworked man with a perpetually sour expression, saved your life, but not your leg. He was a man who had seen too many battles, too many wounds, too many sailors die. He worked on your leg with a grim professionalism, his hands moving with a practiced ease that did nothing to alleviate the agony. The wound was deep, the muscle and sinew torn to ribbons, the bones splintered. He cleaned it, stitched it, and wrapped it in a tight bandage. But he was not a miracle worker. He was just a man with a scalpel and a grim job. The wound festers during the long voyage back to Port Royal, leaving you with a permanent limp and discharge from naval service. The journey was a slow, agonizing crawl, a living hell of pain and fever dreams. You lay in a hammock in the sweltering heat below deck, your leg a throbbing, angry wound, the smell of your own decaying flesh a constant companion. You heard the sounds of the ship, the rhythmic groaning of the rigging, the slap of the waves, the shouts of the sailors, but they were all distant, muffled sounds, like a song played far away. You were a ghost again, a man who was there but not really there, a man who was alone in a world of his own pain. When you finally arrived in Port Royal, a city of whores and drunkards and pirates who had gone straight, you were a ghost who was no longer a man. The wound, a deep, angry scar from knee to ankle, was a constant reminder of your past, of your folly, of the price you had paid for a moment of quiet rebellion. The naval doctor, a man who looked at you with a mixture of pity and contempt, discharged you from naval service. The words, a death sentence. You were a cripple, a man who could not work, a man who was no longer a sailor, a man who was alone in the world. At 32, you're a cripple with nowhere to go. You had lost everything, your crew, your ship, your freedom, and now your ability to live the life you had once known. You were a man who had fought for his soul, and you had not given it up, but you had paid a terrible price. You were a man who had learned to survive, a man who knew how to play the game, but now the game had changed, and you were a player without a hand. The world was a vast, unforgiving ocean, and you were a man without a ship, without a crew, without a home. The price of victory was a life of quiet desperation. You arrived in Port Royal not as a man but as a ghost. The wound in your leg had left you with a permanent limp, a constant, throbbing reminder of the price you had paid for a moment of quiet rebellion. The naval doctor, a man who looked at you with a mixture of pity and contempt, discharged you from naval service. The words, a death sentence. At 32, you were a cripple with nowhere to go. You had fought for your soul and not given it up, but you had paid a terrible price. The world was a vast, unforgiving ocean, and you were a man without a ship, without a crew, without a home. The price of victory was a life of quiet desperation. Port Royal was a city of ghosts. The taverns were still filled with the loud, boisterous laughter of sailors and merchants, but the laughter was a hollow, empty sound. The streets, once a chaotic, vibrant tapestry of life, were now a grim procession of men who had lost everything. You, a man who had once been a part of that tapestry, were now a silent observer, a shadow in the streets, a man who was there, but not really there. You took to watching the trials of the pirates, a grim spectacle that drew a crowd of ghoulish onlookers. You watched as men who had once been your comrades, men who had once shared a mug of rum and a slice of hardtack, were led to the gallows, their faces a mask of fear and resignation. You felt no triumph, only a deep, profound sadness. The golden age was ending, and you were a witness to its last bloody chapter. The most anticipated trial was that of Captain John Calico Jack Rackham. You found a place in the crowd, a place where you could see everything and be seen by no one. You were a man who knew how to be invisible, a man who had learned to fade into the background. Calico Jack, a man who had once been a legend, was now a small, pathetic figure in a faded coat and torn breeches. He stood before the court, a man who had lost his bravado, his swagger, his courage. He was a man who had been broken, and the sight of him made your heart ache. You watched as he was sentenced to death, the words a thunderous final chord in the symphony of his life. The day of the hanging was a hot, oppressive day, the air thick with the smell of sweat and fear. The gallows, a crude, rough-hewn structure, stood on a hill overlooking the harbour, a grim monument to the end of an era. You watched from the crowd as they led him to the gallows, his feet shuffling in the dust, his head bowed in defeat. The crowd was a sea of faces, their eyes a mix of hatred and morbid fascination. You felt nothing but a quiet sadness, a profound sense of loss. You were a man who had survived, but you had lost everything in the process. You watch from the crowd as they hang Calico Jack Rackham. The noose, a symbol of finality, was placed around his neck, and a rope was pulled. He was a man who had once been a pirate, a man who had once been a free spirit, but now he was nothing more than a corpse swinging in the wind, a grim warning to all who dared to defy the law. The trial of Anne Bonny and Mary Read was a different affair entirely. They were led to the court in chains, their heads held high, their eyes filled with defiance. They were not cowards. They were not broken. They were women who had fought for their souls, and they were not about to give them up. You watched from a distance as they stood before the court, their courage a beacon in the cowardice. They were sentenced to death, the words a meaningless sound to women who had stared death in the face and not flinched. But they did not hang. Anne Bonny and Mary Read escaped the noose, both claiming to be with child. The news was a shock that rippled through the crowd, a momentary reprieve in the grim procession of justice. According to the law, a pregnant woman could not be executed until after the child was born. A grim mercy that was a testament to the fact that even in the world of pirates and hangings, there was still a shred of humanity. The women were sent back to their cells, their lives a fragile, uncertain thing, a moment of hope in a world of despair. But for Mary Read, the reprieve was a short one. Mary dies of fever in her cell months later. The news was a quiet, almost unnoticed piece of gossip in the crowded streets of Port Royal. The woman who had fought like a devil, the woman who had held the boarding party at bay single-handedly, was now a ghost. Her story, a brief, tragic footnote in the history of piracy. Anne simply vanishes from the records, as if the sea itself swallowed her story. The news of her escape was a whispered rumour, a legend in the making. Some said she had given birth to her child in prison and was released. Others said she had escaped, a ghost in the night, a woman who had simply disappeared. You, a man who had been a ghost himself, knew the truth. She had not escaped. She had simply become what she was always meant to be, a legend, a story whispered in the dark, a memory of a time when the world was a wide open ocean and every man was his own king. The golden age is ending. Rogers has cleared Nassau, Blackbeard is dead, and the few remaining pirates are running for Madagascar or the gallows. You, a man who had once been a part of that age, were now a cripple in Port Royal, a ghost in a city of ghosts. You had nothing left, no ship, no crew, no freedom, but you had your life, a quiet, desperate, and fiercely guarded thing. You were a man who had learned to survive, a man who knew how to play the game, but now the game had changed, and you were a player without a hand. The world was a vast, unforgiving ocean, and you were a man without a ship, without a crew, without a home. The price of victory was a life of quiet desperation, a life where the ghosts of the past were your only companions. You were a ghost in Port Royal, a man without a past or a future, The wound in your leg had left you with a permanent limp, a constant, throbbing reminder of the price you had paid for a moment of quiet rebellion. The naval doctor, a man who looked at you with a mixture of pity and contempt, discharged you from naval service, the words a death sentence. You had nothing left, no ship, no crew, no freedom, but you had your life, a quiet, desperate, and fiercely guarded thing. You were a man who had learned to survive, a man who knew how to play the game, but now the game had changed, and you were a player without a hand. For years, you drifted through the colonial port cities, a man in search of a future he couldn't find. Your limp made a sailor's life impossible, and your past made you a man to be eyed with suspicion. You worked as a dockhand when you could, your back aching and your leg a constant fiery protest. You took odd jobs, sweeping taverns and cleaning stables. A man who had once been a king, now reduced to a beggar. You were a ghost, a shadow in the streets, a man who was there but not really there. You watched the world change around you. The pirate flags were gone, replaced by the clean, crisp banners of merchant companies and the proud, unyielding symbols of the Royal Navy. The world was being tamed, a wild ocean brought to heel by the long arm of the law. You were a relic of a bygone era, a living ghost in a world that had moved on without you. You eventually found your way to Charleston, a city that was a hub of commerce and a sanctuary from the ghosts of your past. Here, no one knew you. Here, you were just a man with a limp, a quiet man who kept to himself. You found a small, quiet life, a life without adventure, without danger, without the thrill of a chase. You married a woman, a kind, quiet widow who ran a small boarding house. She saw the man you were, a man of quiet strength and a deep, abiding sadness, and she did not ask for your past. She gave you a home, a life, and a quiet place to heal. You had children, a son who looked at you with a mix of awe and wonder, a son who had no idea of the man you had once been. You had a grandson now, a small boy with a wooden sword, a boy who knew only the stories of pirates, not the grim, bloody reality. 20 years later, you sit on your porch in Charleston, a man of 52, watching merchant ships sail peacefully into the harbour that Blackbeard once held hostage. The water is a placid, shimmering thing, a mirror reflecting a quiet sky. There is no tension in the air, no sense of danger, no thrill of the hunt. It is a peaceful, orderly world, a world you had once fought against. The harbour, which had once been a place of chaos and violence, was now a symbol of order and prosperity. You watch the ships, their sails full and their hulls heavy with goods from distant lands, and you feel a strange sense of peace. You are a man who has found a quiet harbour after a long, difficult voyage. Your grandson, a small, boisterous boy with a mischievous glint in his eyes, plays with a wooden sword on the lawn, his small, high voice filling the quiet air with the sounds of battle. He is a child of a different world, a world that has forgotten the days of chaos and violence. He begs for pirate stories, for tales of treasure and adventure and daring raids. You tell him the stories, but you leave out the parts about the bloodshed, the betrayals, the quiet, soul-crushing desperation. You tell him about the wind in your sails, the salt on your lips, the thrill of the chase. You tell him about the sea, a wild, untamed thing that was a constant companion in your youth. You tell him about the Golden Age, a time when every man was his own king, a time when freedom was not just a word, but a way of life. The pain in your ruined leg flares with each change of weather, a permanent reminder of those violent days. It is a constant, nagging ache, a phantom limb that reminds you of the man you had once been. It is the price you paid for your quiet rebellion, the price you paid for a moment of solidarity, with a worthy enemy. It is a scar, a wound, a symbol of a past you could never outrun, no matter how far you sailed, no matter how quiet a life you lived. It is a constant reminder of the price of victory, a life of quiet desperation, a life where the ghosts of the past were your only companions. Sometimes you wonder what became of Anne Bonny, whether she found peace or if she's still out there somewhere under a different name in a different life. You, a man who had vanished from the records, a man who had become a ghost, knew the truth. She had not vanished. She had simply become what she was always meant to be. A legend, a story whispered in the dark, a memory of a time when the world was a wide open ocean, and every man was his own king. She was a ghost in a world that had forgotten how to haunt. You sit on your porch, a man who has found a quiet harbour after a long, difficult voyage, and you wonder if she found one too. As twilight falls, you reflect on what it all meant. The pirate stories you tell your grandson are a sanitized version of the truth, a tale of adventure and daring raids that leaves out the bloodshed, the betrayals, and the quiet, soul-crushing desperation. But as you watch the sun set over the placid waters of the harbour, you realise that the stories you tell are not just a lie. They are a truth that the world has forgotten, a truth that lies hidden beneath the grime and the violence, a truth that is the true legacy of the golden age of piracy. The pirates weren't just thieves and murderers, though they were certainly that. You had seen the violence, the brutality, the cold, calculating cruelty that lay beneath the bravado and the swagger. You had seen men die for a coin, for a moment of a captain's drunken fury, for a simple mistake. You had seen the worst of humanity, but you had also seen something else, something that the world had not seen since the ancient Greeks, something revolutionary. For a brief moment in history, they created something revolutionary. You remember the Pirate Code, a simple set of rules that governed your life aboard the ship. It was a document of law, a promise of a new kind of society, a society where birth didn't matter, where a man was judged not by his past but by his present. Every man, from the cabin boy to the quartermaster, had a vote on every decision, from where to sail to whom to raid. It was a democracy in a world of kings and emperors, a glimpse of a future that would not be seen again for generations. You remember sitting in a circle, your hands on your knees, your eyes on your captain, and you remember the feeling of absolute freedom, of knowing that your voice mattered, that you were not just a sailor, but a free man, a man who had chosen his own fate. It was a fleeting moment in history, a brief glimpse of a world that could be, a world where every man was his own king. It was flawed, violent, and ultimately doomed, but it was also a glimpse of democracy that wouldn't be seen again for generations. You watch your grandson, a child of a different world, a world that has forgotten the days of chaos and violence, and you know that the ideas you fought for, the ideas you lived by, are not dead. They live on in the stories you tell, in the books that will be written, in the legends that will be passed down from generation to generation. The black flag is gone, but the ideas it represented, equality, freedom, the right to choose your own fate, those ideas sail on. You feel the pain in your leg, a constant nagging ache, a reminder of the price you paid. You remember the men you fought with, the men who had died, the women who had lived and vanished. You think of Anne Bonny and Mary Read, two women who had defied the world and paid a terrible price. You think of Mary, who died in a prison cell, her body broken, but her spirit unbroken. You think of Anne, who simply vanished, a ghost in a world that had forgotten how to haunt. You wonder if she found a quiet harbour too, a place to heal, a place to find peace. The golden age of piracy lasted barely 10 years, but in that decade, outcasts and outlaws created a world where every man truly was equal. Perhaps that, more than any buried treasure, is the real legacy they left behind. As you watch the sun dip below the horizon, casting a final golden light on the placid waters of the harbour, you know that you are a man who has lived 2 lives. You were a pirate, a man who had fought for his freedom, and you were a husband, a father, a grandfather, a man who had found a quiet peace. You had lost everything, but in the end you had gained something more valuable than any treasure. A life, a quiet, desperate, and fiercely guarded thing. You had survived, and that, in the end, was the greatest victory of all.